The Marinade.
There's no O in marinade. Let's try it one more time. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
The Marinade.
Marinade.
Bone marinade. The
That's
Marinade.
The Marinade. With Jason Earle.
Then we sat in fluorescent halo. The tiny flowery redemption of sharecroppers and miners and slaves, offering up to our class beneath the TV, the flag and the cross. Our rigid manly twangs and drums, birthmarks to be scrubbed away. But I don't wanna be a whitewash. I don't wanna be an absence. Don't wanna be the
Welcome to The Marinade with Jason Earle, a free-flowing conversation about the creative process with creative people. This is episode 84, and our guest is Caleb Johnson. Caleb is the author of one of my favorite novels of the last few years, y'all. The book is called Treeborne. If you haven't read it, go to your local bookstore or bookshop.org and get a copy. I absolutely loved this book and lived in it and cannot recommend it enough. It's always a treat to speak with an author whose work I love. This was so much fun, and I learned a ton from this conversation. I'm excited to bring it to you. Everyone, my conversation with Caleb Johnson.
worst. You love the best. But I don't wanna be a whitewash. Not a nightbound memory. Don't wanna fortify comedy. I don't wanna be. Yeah, I don't wanna be.
Well, I wanted to start by congratulating you on being a new dad. That's so exciting, man.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah.
So how does that, I guess we can get right into the chaos. So how does
Are we
that-
going or are we recording right away?
Yeah, if you're cool with it, we just roll.
Yeah. How's the sound? I'm out in my writing room, so I'm a little away from the Wi-Fi, but it's generally okay. Am I coming through? fine enough?
You're coming through great and it's smooth, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
can see,
Sorry to derail you there, but I'm just gonna ask and make sure.
No, it's all good. I appreciate it. I would say something. And that's part of this whole thing that's difficult is like you don't have control over the other person's audio, like I just recorded with Todd Snyder and it was just like this huge honor and thrill to get to record with Todd Snyder. And at first I just couldn't hear anything. And I was like, damn it, I've been waiting this since I started this thing, right? Like for this moment, and I have no control over what's going on over there, but it ended up beautifully. So, for the most part, it's worked out. But anyway, fatherhood, chaotic. How's that impacting your process then?
I mean, there's just no process right now, I guess. Yeah. No. I mean, I'm a pretty. I like a schedule. I like routine. Sort of in my work and my process, and I don't have that luxury at the moment. I haven't had it for the last 4 months since Felix was born, which, I expected. And I'd kind of like prepared myself for that change, but it's still, a bit of a shock to the system. And especially for somebody like me who kind of thrives off that routine, it's not always easy to just sort of accept that and say, okay, today he's not going to sleep and he's going to just like be an agent of chaos, as we call him. And I'm not going to get to open a project I'm working on at all. I can think about it off and on when I have a second that doesn't require, attention to him. But I've just had to, I'm still trying to make peace with it, to be honest with you. I'm sure I will be for a long time.
So when you're, all right, so if, it's chaotic and there's an idea that, or maybe a project that you're working on, an idea that's in your head, are you just keeping it up there in your head, or are you like doing a voice memo while changing a diaper with the other hand, or like what does that look like? How are you keeping those ideas?
Yeah. I'll type notes into my phone, which I hate to admit, and I hate that I'm doing that because I was before I had a kid, I was such a big proponent of carrying an actual notebook and pen and paper in my back pocket, and I would pull that out, and jot things down. But it's just easier, to one-handed pick up the phone and type something in the notes, and then email it to myself later. So I do that. I'm lucky. I'm lucky in one respect to have had a bigger project kind of working and stewing and sort of messing with for a while before Felix got here. So it's sort of okay, or more okay, for me not to be composing or revising as much, and to just sort of think about that project and, whatever problems I'm having with it, kind of try to untangle those in my mind, rather than being at the computer. So and I planned it when we knew we were going to have a kid. I was like, okay, I got to get to a place in this project where that feels okay for me, or else my attention is not going to be here with him and all the things that need to be done. I'm going to be just trying to get to this project all the time. So I'm more okay with it because of where I got to sort of pause, composition and revision before he got here. It's sort of good timing, I guess, if there's ever going to be for that.
Right. Well, talking about big projects, I mean, I've told you, and everybody on the show has heard me say, and heard me sing this, is that I just love Treeborne, your novel. And, since I read it, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Is
Thanks.
that You're welcome. And I appreciate it so much. It was one of those books that, I'm constantly reading, and I love the written word. But sometimes, sometimes a book comes along that you're like, you don't let go of for a long time. And I mean, that book's several years old now, and I haven't let go of it, and what's interesting, I love how it came into my life too, because Lee Baines told me he was reading a draft of it, and Lee's such a big part of this show, and he's been such a good friend of the show, and I'm such a huge fan of his music. So it's just one of those beautiful things where this person whose art I respect so much says, "Oh wait, I got this guy you got to get down on. Wait till this book comes out." And I want to get to that whole thing in a minute too. But can you say whether the big project you're talking about is another novel, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's another novel. Yep, it is. I don't know how much I want to say about it because it's in such sort of early stages that it'll change inevitably. I've learned that lesson the hard way, sort of talking too much about one of these bigger projects in the early stages, and then it turns out nothing like that later, but it's set in Southern Appalachia. It's very much concerned with the area, this corner of Western North Carolina where I live, and climate change, and extinction, and nature and family. Sort of, it's not autobiographical by any means, but it's certainly things that are very much at the front of my mind and sort of part of my daily existence are bleeding their way onto the page, which I think is, for me at least, it happens, not intentionally necessarily, but the longer I spend with a project, the more those things tend to bleed over.
How comfortable are you with that? I know, when I write, I find that so much of what I'm writing is it's coming out that way. It is very much, I'm leaving a lot of me on the page, and I've never written a novel. I'm almost done with the first draft of my first novel, and it has made me kind of uncomfortable how much of me came out on the page. How comfortable are you with that being the case?
I'm pretty comfortable with it, man, because I tend to work from such a place of imagination. So that stuff is like, when it does bleed over, it's not necessarily like a one-to-one with something in my life. Like, unless you were somebody like Lee Baines, who is one of my best friends and first readers,
Mm-hmm.
and who I talk to all the time about whatever I'm working on, he can pick those things out and sort of like pin them to something more autobiographical. But, even members of my family they don't read things in progress, you know, they don't read them until they're published. They're not going to be able to figure it out. So I have that sort of curtain of fiction, you know, like plausible deniability of that, which is nice and makes me worry less, I guess.
That's comforting. And I think several authors I've talked to say the same kind of thing, right? Where it's like, it's almost like there's more of, you're thinking it's more you than, and the people around you than you realize. And I think the deeper I go into it, and so much changed, like you said, like I had this concept in my head of what this was going to look like. And then it has just gone in so many different directions that I did not expect. And I fell in love with this one character that I thought was just going to be a minor character. And I think now she should be considered the protagonist, and just all these things that I did not expect. And it seems like that those two things are consistent with most authors I talk to. But one of the things I haven't found yet is like a clear template for a process necessarily. So let's say pre-Felix, and when Felix and it becomes less chaotic, in your perfect world, in your routine, like what does your process look like when you're tackling a big project like that?
I think you kind of have, though, man, just to hear that brief little comment about your book, because for me, what my project is when it comes to writing fiction, at least, is it's all super intuitive, and it's tends to be faster and definitely way messier at first. And I used to really beat myself up about that and be resistant, you know, like I wanted to try to make myself slow down and polish and edit and revise as I move forward through an early draft, because I heard these writers I admire say they did that, you know, or people I knew worked that way. And I reached a point with Treeborne where it was just like, all right, if you're ever going to finish a draft of this, you just got to like lower your head, power through, accept that it's going to be messy and need more work. Because to me, and this is what I tell my students all the time, the real work in writing is revision, you know. Yeah, you got to have some bit of commitment and endurance to get that first, you know, finished quote unquote draft down.
Yeah.
But man, there's a lot of work left to do after that, you know, and that's where the real magic happens, for me at least. So yeah, from a process standpoint, when it comes to fiction especially, but really all prose, I tend to be quick and messy at first, and then I'm like, okay, I think I have most everything down on the page that I need, and now it's a matter of what's got to go, what's got to be moved around, what's maybe got to be amplified in some way, and what's got to be sort of played down a little more. What moments, what scenes, you know, what sections, and that's, I mean, that's not fun for me, to be honest with.
Right.
But it's been pivotal for me to understand that about myself and my process, and to accept it instead of like fighting it tooth and nail, you know, because when I was fighting it more, it was a much more miserable process than it got to be later.
Yeah, that's a lot of heavy lifting. So are you like getting up in the morning and having your coffee and sitting straight down to work with that? Like I said, in a perfect world, if you didn't have chaos at the moment.
Yeah.
Is that what it looks like?
Yeah, I like mornings, man. I really do. I mean, this is not, you know, original to say, but I think it's certainly true for me, is that the earlier I can get up and the less I can let the world in, the better day writing I'm going to have, you know? Yeah. So that means like no phone, no social media, no email, no websites I like to read for news or entertainment, you know. It really means, just like chugging a little bit of that coffee and opening up whatever project I'm putting my attention to and getting into it. I'm not always good at it. You know, I don't always succeed, but that's my aim and goal, is to do that every morning, as early as possible. You know, like I went through stretches with Treeborne, and I even went through stretches with other projects, you know, in the last few years since Treeborne was out, where, you know, I was getting up at like 4, like well before daylight, and coming out to my writing room or my office, wherever it was, and just getting started. And it helps me with the rest of the day too, because even if I don't have the best day of work, I at least got something done. And sort of no matter what plays out later, like maybe I get to come back to it later in the day, because I got a free hour or whatever, but maybe I don't. But at the end of the day, when I go to bed, I'm not kind of kicking myself and saying, well, you got nothing done today, because I've made sure first thing that I got something done. I moved the needle a little bit.
That, man, yes. I mean, all of that resonates so much with me. And I was thinking just today as I was preparing for this, and was thinking about how the most productive I've been probably in my life writing wise was about this time last year during quarantine, because it just like I was still working, was still teaching remotely middle school kids, but it wasn't the same, right? It was like 3 or 4 hours a day that I was in front of kids, and I had until like noon every day that I had work to do, but for the most part I could get up at my normal time and then I could just do the work. And having that space and being disciplined to get up and do it led to just that repetition led to more and better work. And it was those morning hours that did it for me, because by this point in the day, like here we are at 3:15 Eastern time, and I'm done. I might jot a few ideas down here, here or there, but like not usually by this point in the day, my brain's just like, nah, put a baseball game on.
Same. I'm totally with you. It's not happening. I can't. My friends make fun of me. I'm not a night owl at all. Like I can't even for getting work. I just go to bed or I have a hard time staying up late unless it's something I really need to stay up late for. So I'm definitely not going to have the kind of clear-headedness to do any decent work at night. So I don't try to anymore, and that's one thing I try to tell my students a lot is like, figure out when works best for you, in terms of what part of the day, and shoot for that, like block off that time and be there during that time of day, rather than trying to force it at a time when you're not turned on, or you're not going to have the time. And if you don't do it every day, fine, but some regularity, I think, when it comes to that, it certainly benefits me in my work.
Well, yeah, and that also makes sense. That what you said about the regularity, routine is everything for me. Like when you let off by saying you like that routine, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, right now I have not been getting up and writing, and so it's like, and I can feel it too. I can feel it in like in me emotionally, like in the back of my mind, I'm going, dude, you still have this thing that you've been working so hard on for so long that you're not chugging away at. And like, I just need to commit to getting back in the routine. It's like anything else, man. If I'm exercising all the time, I'm exercising all the time. If I'm writing all the time, I'm writing all the time. But if I'm sleeping in all the time, I'm sleeping in all the time. Not that I sleep in very much, but still that extra hour can make a difference. You talked about getting up at 4. If I got to be at work at 7:45, if I get up at 5, I can write. If I get up at 6, I can't.
Yeah. No, I know, man. I taught middle school for a couple years in Philadelphia when we lived there, and I had to be in the school building at 7:30 at the latest. Like that was pushing it, and so I had that same pressure. I had to get up, and I tend to do a little better with that pressure and that schedule. To making sure I'm being consistent and getting up and doing it. When I have too much time or space in my schedule, I'll slack and get a little lazy, because it's like, well, I could wake up an hour later, or I don't have to do it right now because I've got later in the day. So too much free time is a tricky thing for me too. And it's a luxury, to have that kind of schedule and that kind of job where you can say, well, I've got too many hours, but it's different for everybody. And I know about myself that, I'm good for, 3 hours of legitimate work, like not messing around on the internet or something. Like if I'm actually working and focusing for 3 hours in a day on a project, then that's good. I could make myself sit at the computer for 6 hours if I had the time, but it's probably going to be 3 hours sort of wasted because I'm just going to delete whatever the next day or not really be concentrating or focused,
That seems like some kind of magic number. It seems like I don't want to misquote anybody, but other authors that I've had on the show, I feel like that's, for the most part, that's what they say. Micah Schnabel did not say that. Micah said he will get up and work all day. I mean, but he also will admit that he throws away a lot,
Yeah.
in his process. But okay, so let's talk a little bit about teaching and doing, right? So that's something that I think is really interesting, being a teacher myself, and then you as a teacher of writing. Rick Bragg said about you, I've heard a lot of great old editors say that you can't teach writing, that it's born. Caleb Johnson can make you believe it. First of all, wow. Rick Bragg said that, right? It's got to feel great. But also, do you believe that about writing in general, that like there are some who are just born to do it?
Well, you can't believe half of what comes out of Rick's mouth. Take what you will. Take what half you will of that comment. Man, I've gone back and forth a lot about this, and it's changed for me the more I have taught. Yeah, I think writing is definitely something you can practice, and you can read widely and often and learn, and you can improve, right? But I think that some people are born with keener eyes, with the ability to observe and take in life and then transfer that onto the page more naturally, maybe, than others. And I think you can practice that too. Journalists do it quite often, but voice, style, yeah, it can be learned somewhat, but also, some people are born with a certain cadence, whether it's verbal or what they get on the page. And no teacher, no matter how great they are, is giving them that, right? Is really improving that. It's just coming natural. So I guess it's a little bit of both. I don't think you can, if you are born with that sort of voice, or that vision that you're able to get down on the page, it's not going to get you across the finish line alone. You still got to read widely and learn, and you still have to practice, and you still have to revise and figure out how to sort of polish that as sharply as possible. So I don't think you can necessarily have one without the other, right? But I couldn't go into the classroom, a couple days a week and sit there and talk to these students and give them feedback on their work if I didn't think that writing was a practice that you could work at and improve upon, and get better at, quote unquote. The more you do that, and the more you live and exist. I do think it's sort of it's not really a job in my mind. It's a way of life. Like, I think you have to really, if you want to be great at it, I think you have to be willing to commit to a particular way of living that the folks who don't maybe aren't gonna be quite as great, quote unquote, or as artful, maybe is a better term, when it comes to what's on the page.
Yeah. So how much of the equation, when it comes to voice specifically, I guess, how much of the equation do you think is your upbringing and your environment, especially at a young age?
I'm probably, for me, it's a huge part of it.
Yeah.
I can only speak for myself, but yeah, I don't know. I grew up before the internet, like in the country. And so talking and telling stories, was just everywhere. It's what people did, and so it's something I've lived with for a long time. I learned, I've said this before, but I really did learn from an early age that there was some cultural value in being able to tell a entertaining story or a sad story or a scary story, something that would hold someone's attention. I was taught by my mom that books were important and good, quote unquote, like keys to like living well, basically. It wasn't so much money or kind of anything like that, but it was books, right? And so I was in the library constantly, after school. She would take me there, and those things definitely matter, right? And but those are things folks can teach themselves and do for themselves later too. I was privileged and fortunate that I didn't have to from an early age. But those things can definitely be learned too. If someone has the, space and the willingness to do it for themselves. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. You've spoken quite a bit about, in interviews about your upbringing and how you spent so much time like in the woods. And did you grow up an only child, or do you have siblings?
I have a younger sister, but I was an only child for the first 8 or so years of my life, which was pretty, I have a lot of memories from that time of it just being me, and I do have cousins who are also younger. So I was the first grandchild, oldest cousin, so there was this, almost a decade of my life that I recall vividly of being the only kid around. So I felt like an only child for quite a while.
And do you think that had an impact sort of on your imagination in one way or the other?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was cool because the adults in my life interacted and played with me in imaginative ways, like I had this great aunt who would go in the woods with me, and we would essentially improvise, we would assign each other characters and make up stories and go on these adventures, or my mom, she stayed home to raise me a lot of my childhood. And so she would get down with the G.I. Joes or the Micro Machines or something, and sort of get involved with whatever story I was telling with those toys. So I was fortunate in that way that I did have people, adults who interacted. But I didn't have other kids as much. I had my friends at school and stuff, but not in the family and not at family gatherings for a while. And even when my sister came along and my other cousins, for those first few years, they were babies. They weren't walking, they weren't talking, they weren't, going off with me in the woods. So yeah, I mean, there was a long time I did feel kind of like an only child, and I guess I was brought up like one.
Yeah, I have a half sister, but and she's a lot older than me, and I grew up an only child, and I think that it did contribute to my own imagination because I just kind of had to. I mean, there were kids on the block and stuff. I grew up in like a small town in Central Florida, and before that we lived in Kentucky, and it was a really small town in Kentucky, and there really wasn't anybody around. We had some land and there wasn't anybody around, and there was a pond out back, and there was you could ride your bike for however many miles. I don't know. In my little brain, it was forever, but, and there'd be another friend, but they're way far away. And to get to them would be quite a bit, quite a hike. And so I think that did contribute for me, at least, to just to allowing my imagination to go a lot of different places. And I think my family encouraged it, but I think the town I was in Florida discouraged those kinds of things. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about place. On this show, I like to explore as much as I can, especially with Southerners, the duality of the Southern thing, as the truckers say. And, it's something that, and it's a kind of a concept that I think Lee, for example, who we talked about earlier, talks about quite a bit and confronts head on. And I think you do in your writing as well. You don't shy away from discussing race, for example, in Treeborne. There's some heavy racial themes in there and some things that when you grow up in the South, you're wrestling with quite a bit. And so I wonder whether just the community in general was encouraging your creativity. It sounds like your family for sure was. Was your greater community encouraging the creative process and you being a creative person?
I had a few teachers in public school who definitely did, I mean, one of my earliest memories of writing was my first grade teacher. I kind of flew through the assignments every day. I completed them much faster than my classmates. And so there was kind of nothing to do, right? I could just sit there or whatever. So instead of just letting me sit there, she pulled me over to a side table and said, write me a story. And just kind of turned me loose. And that became my thing, whenever and it kind of sort of became a carrot on a stick for me a little bit, because I knew if I finished my work soon enough, and there was extra time, I would get to go write stories, by myself, like be in my head. And I enjoyed that. So I did that, and I had other teachers throughout the years English teachers who said, they read my essays or papers or whatever in class and said, you're a good writer, and that definitely helped a lot. I also have an aunt, my mom's youngest sister, who she's closer to a sibling in terms of age. She's only 8 years older than me. And she is a poet and a teacher. And she was much more, she sort of like forged the way in terms of knowing about art and music and movies and books and things. And then passing it down to me, and folks in the community knew that about her. They knew she was creative and, sort of different than other kids in the community. And so they sort of made that connection for me sometimes, when they saw me, they said, oh, you're like your Aunt Jessica, in this way. And that sort of tagged it to where I thought, well, like, am I, and it sort of like made me proud, and feel good because I looked up to her. We spent a lot of time together growing up. So there was that, but aside from her, there weren't people in the community who, my grandmama painted in oils. So she, did oil paintings. But aside from something like that, there weren't musicians in my family, at least not one still alive when I was around. There weren't creatives, sort of making things. And there certainly was no one around who it was like, hey, here's an example of a career path in the arts. Like that was just non-existent. Yeah.
I think that's so interesting because like there's so many folks like, especially in Kentucky where I was born, but and to a lesser extent, but I mean maybe not to a lesser extent in Central Florida, there were folks who were clearly creative people. Like they were great great storytellers, like you mentioned earlier, or they had some other thing that they could do that was they were the ones, they were creating these things, but no one ever talked about the arts as any sort of career path. And you mentioned earlier the idea of like that writing is this way of life. At what point was there a moment where you went, all right, I'm good at this and I'm going to chase this. Like, this is what I have to do, or this is what I want to do.
Yeah. So when I went to college at the University of Alabama, when I graduated high school, me and my best friend from high school, Philip, both went down there on partial scholarships. And that was a big deal because no one else in our graduating class of 32 or 36 or whatever went to a 4-year college out of high school. That some folks went to community college, other folks went to work, went to the military, and so it was a big deal. And it wasn't just our graduating class, but in ones prior and then following, just not many folks did that from my school, so it was a big deal. And I wasn't really ready for it, to be honest with you. And I thought I wanted to be a doctor because I was like, I have to have a job, quote unquote, that makes money, quote unquote, and this is a good career, and I had people tell me that, and I was the salutatorian in my class, I made good grades, and so it seemed like a natural thing. And I got to Alabama and I hated the classes I was taking, the science classes. I was doing horrible. I didn't want to study. I hated the labs. It was not a fit. And that first year was not great. So I wound up moving home the next year and going to community college myself back home. And that was a real, I was pretty ashamed of that decision at the time, like it seemed like I had failed, I'd gone off to Tuscaloosa, which is like 90 miles from where I'm from, but it might as well be Mars or something,
Yeah.
And, it just, I felt like I'd failed, I disappointed everyone, even though no one said that to me. That's sort of what I put on myself. And so I spent a year in community college and I was like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. But I had, again, this great English teacher who's still a friend of mine today. And she had taught my aunt I was talking about, who's the poet. And she had actually taught my mom too, who went back to school late in life and became an elementary school teacher. And so she knew my family. She knew, what was up, how I'd come back from Alabama. And she was very much a reader. She very much loved to go see, serious films, and she loved to talk about them. And she went to plays. She was just a much more cultured person than I had ever known and been close to in my life. And she kind of took me under her wing, and we were friends. Even that year I went to college, saw some movies together, went to concerts together, and sort of encouraged me to write, and so that was what I was kind of good at, and so when I got back to Alabama, I was like, okay, what can I do that allows me to write? But also I do come from a working class family, and I was going to have student loan debt, and I couldn't just be an English major. I felt like, and I didn't want to teach because that's what my mom did, so somebody said, why don't you major in journalism? And it never occurred to me, the newspaper was always in my house. My dad picked one up on the way home from work every day. I read it. I saw him reading it, but it just like never occurred to me that even though the bylines were on the stories, that was a job. There were real people who wrote those stories and, got paid for them. And I thought, okay, I can do that. Like, that's writing. I'll tell stories. Like, it seems like a good way to spend a life, but also there's money, enough to pay bills, which is not necessarily true, then, especially now. But this was my thinking, And so I did that. I went and that's what I declared as my major, and I started working at the campus newspaper. And I eventually, I had another teacher there, Bill Keller, who I'm still great friends with, that encouraged me. And I eventually got in Rick Bragg's magazine writing class, and he encouraged me, and I was kind of off to the races from there. So that's when I decided I would, write for a living, I guess, even though the living was really meager. I graduated, and my first job out of college was at the Selma Times-Journal in Selma, Alabama, which is a daily newspaper. And yet again, I was woefully unprepared for what that was going to mean, 6 days a week, publishing 5-6 stories a day in a place that I wasn't familiar with. The online transition was just kind of starting to happen at newspapers. It was just tough in a lot of different. All my friends were still in Tuscaloosa. It was tough in a lot of different ways, but that's kind of when I made that jump, I guess, were those couple years.
Man, I'm so glad you said that, because I think we have some young folks that listen to the show, young writers, and I think, or writers and aspiring writers, and I hesitate to give advice ever, because I'm not someone who considers himself much of an accomplished writer myself. But I think what you just said about what I do feel confident in saying is, I've got the best job in the world now for my day job. I love teaching. I love what I do. I love the time it affords me. I love the interactions every day. I feel fulfilled every day. And my mom was a teacher as well. There was no damn way I was going to be a teacher. Like, that is the last thing I was going to do, right? I was not going to be a teacher. I went to school and I majored in business. And I don't give a damn about business, Caleb. I just majored in business because I was like, that's how you make money. Almost exactly the same in a different part of the world at a different time. I went through all of that shit. And then I ended up like majoring in political science, and then ultimately getting a degree in political science with a minor in philosophy. And as I was studying philosophy, I was like, this is what I should have been doing. I should have been doing this. I should have been studying English or journalism or something else that was going to keep me fulfilled every day and fire me up, rather than chasing money. Because now it's not like I'm making money now. I'm a teacher, but I love my work and I feel fulfilled every day. And as I look back on it, I ended up failing out of school and then having to go back, and ultimately doing quite well. But I suffered quite a bit because I was chasing what other people thought I should do. And even into my 20s, like, I went to law school and graduated from law school almost as I look back on it because people said I wasn't going to, rather than because I was super passionate about the law. And just like, what a silly reason to go, but the ego and the hubris, for me at least, the ego and the hubris in that time was like, oh, you don't think I'm going to go? I'm going to go, and really prove them wrong, getting all this debt that I have now from law school that I don't really use my degree for, my degree in my life very much. But like, if I had it all to do over again, that's the big thing. It's like just not chasing some sort of monetary value, also not chasing what other people's expectations might have been, and just going, this is the thing that motivates me, that moves me. I'm going to chase this thing. So I'm really glad you said that, because I can relate a lot.
Yeah, it took me a long time to figure it out, and I definitely made mistakes along the way, and I guess that's just how I was going to have to learn and figure it out, was by doing it, And
well, and somebody listening to this is hearing it and is still going to make the same mistakes we did, right? Like, like people probably told me plenty of those kinds of things, and you do have to go through it, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think especially for a certain kind of person, and depending on your background, I really took a lot of the burden of my family and our history and sort of social class onto my own shoulders, more so than I probably needed to. But I was, the first. I was really like one of the first to graduate from a 4-year college, from a university, and get a 4-year degree. And I wanted to do it the right way, or what I thought was the right way, the practical way, the way that would make money and move, I would make more than my, the capitalist American dream, of I would do better than my parents did, which doesn't exist now, if it ever did, and financially anyway. But eventually I just realized what mattered more to me was living what felt like a good life. And the best way to live for me is to have time to write, to live slowly as I can, and to spend a lot of time in my own head and in the heads of other people through their work that they put out. And do I think teachers should be paid more? Totally. And not just because I am one, but absolutely. But also, it's just not the most important thing to me. I need to be able to eat, and I need to pay my bills, and I'll take care of my kid. But I don't need a whole lot of other stuff, as long as I have that time and that, really it's a community that I've, whether it's like the books and records and movies I have, and have watched, or the actual people that I've got to be close with that made them, like that is the most valuable thing to me in my life. And I think it will continue to be.
That's so cool. Music's come up a couple of times, and I see a guitar there behind you. How often do you pick that thing up?
Probably more often than I should. Procrastinate from working on whatever prose I need to be working on. Yeah, probably more than I should, but not enough to be more than a hack.
Well, but you didn't have musicians in your family, you said, necessarily. So when did you get that bug?
Oh, I tried to get it as like in my early teenage years, and then I played sports in high school, so there's really no time for that, and when I moved back to college, I kind of tried to again a little bit, and for the college newspaper, I was always a big fan of music. My aunt, who I've mentioned a few times, would introduce me to all kinds of things, and that I had no sort of access to or idea. She had a subscription to Rolling Stone, which was like pre-internet, the lifeline if you lived in rural America to any kind of popular culture. And so I'd always been a huge fan. When I got to college and I was working for the campus paper, I actually covered, I think I was called like an arts and culture reporter, so it was like local music, bands coming through, things like that. And I got to be friends with a lot of musicians and spent a lot of time around them, and slowly, wanted to try to like imagine my way into also playing some music. I think Barry Hanna had a quote that was like, something like every writer secretly wants to be a rock and roll star, and I don't know, it seems true for a lot of writers that I know. But I will say, but now it's like almost, now some of the rock and roll stars are like, no, we want to be writers, and publish books too. So it's like we're just trading places up in here or something.
That's funny. Are you ever picking at the guitar and some sort of idea that translates to a different project comes up?
Uh, not not really, man. Not really. I did. I think I've only said this at like events, so I guess if I'm gonna say it now, I'm gonna put it on the record.
Nice.
But I did. I did take some of the lyrics I have written and put them in Treeborne as belonging to characters who sang or wrote lyrics of some kind. And I
Wow.
did that mostly um, as sort of like a inside joke with some of my friends, because some of my friends from Tuscaloosa will, give each other shit. Like, I guess seems to be kind of like a male thing to do oftentimes even, but just really kind of giving each other hell. And they would say like you're an okay songwriter, but you're a terrible singer. Like if you could just read the songs, like just don't play them for us, and give me shit. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna take your advice to heart, and I'm gonna put it in the damn book here. And they picked it up and kind of knew that was the case, but just I guess the average reader didn't. But that was one instance, but it's not something I like sort of intended to do. It just sort of happened, I guess. And then it was like kind of an inside joke.
I love that. I'm so glad you shared that too. When your friends are giving you shit, is that just sitting around hanging out, or do you play your songs out ever? Play at open mics or anything like that?
Back then it was sitting around just hanging out, but eventually when I moved to Wyoming for my MFA, my graduate degree, I again got to be friends with some musicians there, and there's this fantastic like Western bar downtown called the Buckhorn. And it's like, if you imagine sort of a stereotypical Western bar, it's what it is, like plate glass windows facing the street. You walk in, it's real dark. Above your head on the wall is all kinds of taxidermy. The bar has a mirror behind it, and there's a bullet hole in the glass in the mirror from when someone got drunk and was going to shoot their cheating spouse from across the street, and they've just like left the bullet hole in the mirror. So they would have an open mic night there, and me and some buddies who were musicians or other writers who played, we would go down there on Sunday nights, mostly because they had a drink discount if you played open mic. So I would do that some, and I don't do it with any regularity. It's more of just, back in the days when folks could safely hang out in the inside or somewhere together, the guitar would come out or somebody would bring something, and sort of pass it around and do that. It's nice for me because I don't consider myself a musician at all. I don't think anybody who's heard me play would, but it's a hobby I can have and something to do that feels, it just feels better to do that than to like sit down and watch 4 hours of Netflix. Like I wind up feeling, if I pick up a guitar and I'm playing around and singing or whatever, I feel better about myself having done that than I do if I like binge some TV, so it's a way to kill time or maybe procrastinate that I think is maybe for me a little more valuable than just like binging some TV or something.
Yes, and I would say for me I'd go even further and just say that it's cathartic. I'd say that it's it's my spiritual experience. I'm not a church goer. I play music. I'm a rudimentary guitar player who gets a lot out of those 7 chords that I feel comfortable with.
I'm with you on
right.
that. And I will say, having a kid now, it's like babies are so easily impressed, so couldn't impress my friends, but it's nice to be able to pull out the guitar and sing a song or two, and then have somebody smile about it as opposed to kind of give me hell.
That's great.
And fun to we're always playing music around the house, and it's fun to introduce this new human to music we like, and to that joy that music can play. And I mean, man, I spent so much time in my early 20s going to shows and traveling around with bands, and like it was a kind of pivotal foundation for me when I did start to to take myself more seriously as a writer and kind of commit to that way of life, that I had been around, they weren't prose writers necessarily, but I've been around these lyricists, these musicians who they also weren't afraid to be like, no, like I'm in a band or I'm a musician, like we're playing a show, like we're going to do this, and to kind of go for it in that way, to see those examples, since I didn't grow up with them in my community or my immediate family. Whether it was Lee Baines or my buddy Blaine Duncan, who was in Tuscaloosa, or just, Elliot and Matt Patton and all those dudes in the Dexatines. And, these were guys who I wrote about in the paper, and then they became friends, and then they became examples I needed of how to be writers and artists, and how to and make things, and do it, and kind of go all in on it. And that was supremely important to me when I was in my early 20s.
So those are the bands that you're talking about when you're saying you were writing about, you're like the Dexatines and Lee. What was that? I mean, at that time, like now I feel like I have a connection to all of those folks, but not all of them. But I mean, I know Lee kind of, and I feel like I am in the same orbit as the Dexatines guys. But like when that was happening, it was just so exciting to me. Like those bands I was watching from afar, and I just thought, like, this is the coolest fucking thing. Like this is the sound that I always wished that somebody would make, but I didn't know I wished somebody would make it. What was it like at that time?
It's crazy to look back on now, man, because at the time I felt like, when it came to the Dexatines at least, and I arrived in Tuscaloosa and started seeing them play shows, I felt like I was sort of late to the party, because the famous bar, the Chucker in Tuscaloosa, was shut down, where the Dexatines kind of got their start to some degree. And the record shop down on the strip near campus had shut down, where some of those dudes used to work and hang out. And so I felt like I had sort of missed out on a bit of the Tuscaloosa music scene glory days, which I think is often the case in a college town, because they're so, people are coming and going all the time, right? There are these eras and these moments when everybody's there and everybody's playing and making things, and then people grow up and get married, or they move away and get a job, or whatever, life happens, and college towns are transient places in the South, especially, which can be cool, but it also means there's fallow periods. But I'll tell you, man, I'll never forget. It's total happenstance that me and Lee met and became such good friends. It's really crazy to look back on. But I was going with the Dexatines to Athens, Georgia, because they were playing a show at the 40 Watt Club. And they were like, I wasn't writing about it. They were just like, come along, and the Truckers were playing a show in town that weekend. And I loved the Truckers, and I was like, sure, I will go and hang, stay in our hotel room, just like hang out. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And so I went, and wound up that Lee had been corresponding with Elliot from the Dexatines. Lee was still in New York in college at the time, and he'd been corresponding with him because Lee was thinking about moving back to Alabama. And, he was playing music up there, but he wanted to, come back and play music and write and stuff. And he was a big fan of the Dexatines too. And Lee knew the Dexatines and Truckers were playing in town too. And he came down from New York, and he had a friend from high school in Athens. And so independently, we were both in town to see these shows, and we ran into each other, oddly enough, at a frat house, because the Dexatines played like an afternoon crawfish boil at this frat house on campus. And, I definitely didn't look like, or wasn't hanging out with the UGA frat dudes. And so Lee and I got to talking, and he found out I was from Earle, which is like near Jasper, Alabama, and which is near Birmingham, where he's from. And we just kind of got to talking, and we saw each other throughout the weekend. And then it got to be, the day we were coming back and leaving town, and I was going back to Tuscaloosa, and Lee was like, I need a ride to the airport, and I was like, well, just get in, man. Like, I'll drop you off at the airport in Atlanta. And we went back through Atlanta and stopped and ate food. And we just really hit it off and had a great conversation. And those things will happen if you go to shows, like that's one thing I love about when live music exists, is because you meet people and you strike up these conversations, and sometimes they turn into friendships, and that's really cool. But I still didn't expect it to be the kind of same thing, the thing it's turned out to be. But Lee had told me, he didn't talk much about his music or the fact that he was a songwriter, you know, or sang or played guitar. He really underplayed it, to be honest with you. And I got back to Tuscaloosa and I pulled up his old band's MySpace page. This was how long ago it was.
Yeah.
And I listened to the 3 or 4 songs there, and I was just like, holy shit, this guy's like, he's the real deal. This is amazing. You know, this isn't just some guy who's like, yeah, I've got a band or whatever. Like he's a real artist, you know.
That's fucking smart and great.
Guitar. Yeah, like the stories and the songs were so great. And I was like, okay, when he moves back, like I've got to see him play. You know, I didn't even think like I was like a fan then, you know. And he did move back, and the first place I saw him play, it was a 3-piece, I think, a couple friends of his that they played this like, it's like a bar / restaurant, some little venue in Montevallo, which is this little liberal arts college town outside of Birmingham. And I drove up for it, and there weren't that many people there. And it was kind of like a weirdly lit, you know, too bright for like a show kind of thing, but it was amazing. It was the best thing I'd ever seen live. And it only got better from there, man. It just like, he formed bands, and I don't know. Looking back, it's a real lucky time to have met him.
That's amazing. What a great story. What year is that?
2005, 05, 06 maybe.
Okay, so that's the Truckers with Isbell still in the Truckers.
Yeah.
I mean, for folks listening, like to get context here, and then Lee played with the Dexter Teens for a little while, right? Didn't he?
He did. Yeah. He played with them for a while, and the time he played with them, we actually lived together with a couple other dudes in this big ramshackle house in Birmingham on the south side of town. And he was writing a lot of the songs that went on to be on the first Glory Fires record, and I was writing the stories that helped get me into graduate school. And it was just a crazy time. And then like shortly after that, kind of around the time I moved to Wyoming, which was in 2011 for graduate school, things were blowing up more. And I'll never forget the year before I moved. There's this dive bar. It's still the same name and same place now, but it's not the same kind of dive bar anymore. But in Tuscaloosa, called Egan's, and it's been sold and is under new ownership, and it's really lost its soul and kind of crowd of regulars. But the night that Alabama played Auburn in football, and Cam Newton was the quarterback at Auburn and led Auburn to an amazing comeback, which just destroyed my soul. Lee and them opened, or no, they didn't open, but they headlined, and the band that opened for them was a band then unknown called the Shakes. I watched the game and was extremely upset and tried to like drown my sorrows for a while. So I was a little late getting to the show. And I just remember walking in Egan's, which is kind of like a cigar box of a bar. And then the Shakes, who went on to be the Alabama Shakes, were playing already, and just being like, who the fuck is this? Like what, you know, like you walked in and you were just like, I'm not going to say I knew they were going to blow up and be like Grammy winners and stuff, but you were just like, oh, this isn't just like a regular opening band, you know? And then Lee and them played after, and of course, like tore the place down. And but things like that happened, you know, at that time and place. And it was super cool and lucky to have been there for it, you know?
That's great, man. Thank you for sharing all of that. I know you got to get back to the chaos, but this has been such a pleasure. We usually end on, you know, speaking of music and books and all the stuff we talked at films, we end on what you're getting down on, like what art has you inspired at the moment outside of your own work.
Oh man, let me actually
go.
No, let me grab something here.
Okay.
Oh no, my wife has it inside. Hold on 1 second. So I read one thing you can do a lot of with a baby, if you can tune out the crying and the noise and stuff, is read, actually. So I have been reading a lot these 4 months.
Nice.
And so I read this trio of what I think of kind of like farm novels that have just, they all three sort of rearranged my thinking on what a novel can be. And they were so beautiful at the sentence level, which is pretty essential for me as a reader. Like if the sentences aren't lovely and interesting and there's not some kind of logic to them, I have a hard time sticking with it. So the one I don't have out here, because my wife is reading it now, is called The Meadow by James Galvin, who's also a poet. And it's set in like northern Colorado, southern Wyoming. It's just like a beautiful lyrical book of vignettes about this meadow and this sort of like parcel of land that different people live on and around. And then this one, I do have a couple here. This novel Snake by Kate Jennings, who's also a poet. It is set on a farm in Australia, and it's just lovely and really sad too, and heartbreaking. And then The Works of Love by Wright Morris is the other one. And this one's much funnier. It's sad too. They're all three sad in their own ways, but this was much funnier if you like Charles Portis at all, who wrote True Grit and a lot of other great novels. It's kind of in that vein, sort of like a dark rural humor. So all three of those novels, just like, I felt lucky to encounter them all in a row and to have them as this kind of triptych in my reading life right now. So I love those. And then I'll just like give another shout out to Lee, who is having his next album mastered as we record this. And
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I've heard the songs, and I have read the lyrics, and I've heard different recordings and mixes and everything. So, and they're great, man. They're great as usual. And I don't know when they're going to release it, but I would imagine in the not too distant future. So I'm lucky to get a sneak peek at those, and I'm sure you and everybody who listens will love them too.
Oh, that's exciting. That motivates me to reach out to him and get him on the show again. It's been years. I mean, it's pretty wild to think that I was introduced to your work. I guess it was like Treeborne came out in what, 2018? Is that right?
2018. So
it would have been 2017 that he was telling me about it. I guess it would have been like the spring of 2017. It's one of those conversations that I'll never forget. I actually met him a couple of times, and the thing that he has that quality that so many great interview subjects have, where like, and just good people, where it's like you're the only person in the world when you're talking to him. And I remember so anything he says, like, listen to this or read this, I'm like, all right, yep, I'm on it. And so I'm so glad we had that conversation, and that led me to your work, and that led to this conversation. I'm just really grateful for your time, Caleb. This has been such a pleasure.
Me too, man. And thanks for doing it. Thanks for having me on. And, the work you do is super important on here to kind of pass along these recommendations and bring together this community of folks who make things. And I'm just super grateful for it, man.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. We'll get back to the chaos, and we'll talk sometime soon, hopefully.
Okay, sounds good. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
See you.
Caleb Johnson, y'all. Thank you so much, Caleb. Thank all of you for listening. This was such an honor. I'm grateful that we have so many wonderful musicians on, but it's so cool to speak with other artists, especially authors. I mean, selfishly, I like mining the brains of authors just so I can try to get better at my own craft. This was so much fun. CalebJohnsonAuthor.com for all things Caleb. I can't wait for that new project he was talking about. I'm stoked for it. I don't blame him for going in, not wanting to go into detail about it. Of course, you don't want to talk about your work in progress, but Man, I am excited to read that. Treeborne again, y'all. Usually, so here's an example of how much I love Treeborne. Usually, I order a book and then read it. Especially if it's from like a newer book, right? So if it's a classic, I might get it from the library, or if it's someone I don't know, I might get it from the library, quite frankly. But if it's someone like Willie Vlotton or Brandy Carlisle, or all these folks that I've been reading recently, Will Johnson, our friends Rod Picott and C.H. Hooks, I always try to order a copy, and usually once I read it, even if it's someone I love and appreciate and someone who's been on the show, usually I try to find someone to pass that book on to. But with Treeborne's one of those that will forever sit on my shelf. I just spent so much time with that book and lived in it and loved it. I remember moments reading it. Those books that you remember like sitting in a particular place reading, or you might remember a mood that you were in at that time. That's how Treeborne is for me. So I can't recommend it enough. CalebJohnsonAuthor.com for all things Caleb. The song you're hearing in this episode is Whitewash by our good friends Lee Baines III and the Glorifiers, and that's from their album Live at the Nick. Big thanks to Lee, who obviously featured enormously in this episode, for agreeing to allow us to play this song as part of the show. It just made too much sense, right? I thought about reaching out to somebody local, which I tend to do when we have somebody who's not a musician on the show. I try to get promote some of my friends who are doing great work. But for this one, I was like, I got to reach out to our boy Lee, and of course he didn't disappoint. And I know Lee, as mentioned in the episode, is working on some new stuff, so stoked for that. Of course, one of our all-time great guests and one of the great dudes making music today. MarinadePodcast.com for all things The Marinade. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter. If you really like what we're doing, please consider joining our Patreon community, where for just a few bucks a month, you can gain access to our Patreon exclusive show, Jason's Journey, where I talk about the moments that shape my creative life. If you can't swing it, do all the free stuff, y'all. Follow us on social media, like I mentioned. Tell a friend about this show. Subscribe on your podcast app. That makes a big difference. Leave us a rating. Thank you so much to everybody who's left a rating, especially on Apple Podcasts, which is kind of one of the big ones. But wherever you listen to podcasts, if you can leave us a rating, 5 stars, if you love what we're doing, that would be amazing, and it makes a big difference. The biggest thing is just continuing to listen. We have so many great episodes coming up. The aforementioned Willie Vlotton is on the way. We sat down with Casey Anderson again, and it was so good. I mean, such a wonderful conversation. We have just incredible things happening. Our first live Patreon conversation with Seth Walker, our good friend who wrote this wonderful book, Your Van is on Fire, that I highly recommend. It's just getting better and better, right? So I've been proud of everything we've done, but I also want to acknowledge that it just continues to get better, and that's thanks to all of you for listening. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate you so much. All right, y'all, it's time for What I'm Getting Down On, the segment of the show where I talk about the art that is inspiring me at the moment. My partner Chris and I bonded over films when we first met. In the 7+ years since that day, we have made a tradition of watching Academy Award nominees together. We try to watch as many as possible across multiple categories. And last week we watched Nomadland, which won all the awards, including Best Picture. It's good, but I didn't think Best Picture worthy. Frances McDormand is outstanding as a protagonist. So I certainly believe that Frances deserves all the awards for that. But it didn't really move me as much as I kind of expected. And the next night, we kind of looked at some options. And then, before I get to that, let me say another quick thing about Nomadland and Frances McDormand. I'm not the first person to point this out, I'm sure, but I was thinking about it, and like, she won Best Actress. And I was thinking, like, why isn't it like Server, right? Like, why is there We don't say waiter and waitress anymore. Why is there best actor and best actress instead of just best actor? And then it can include maybe double the number of people. And I guess maybe the counter argument is because there's been so much sexism in the industry that women would get shut out of that. And that's probably true. But at the same time, I mean, lots of women are doing amazing work that's better than the men, and there's this implication that like they need their own category. I don't know. It's an interesting conversation, and if you disagree with me, I'm not really taking much of a stance on this. I'm just curious about it. But if you want to hit us up on Twitter or Instagram and share your thoughts on that, please do so. It's just something I was thinking about as we were watching the film, and then after the fact when I was kind of doing some research on it. The film that blew my mind, though, is called Another Round. It's a Danish film directed by Thomas Vinterberg. It's about four buddies. They're all high school teachers, and they're disenchanted with their lives. And so they decide to experiment with microdosing alcohol to make their existence a little more bearable. It is hilarious and heartbreaking. Just so good, so perfectly acted and written. It's just wonderful. So check that out. Another Round, it's called. It won Best International Film at the Academy Awards. I've been listening to Jamestown Revival's Fireside with Louis L'Amour EP, which was inspired by the collected short stories of Louis L'Amour, Volume 1. I picked up a copy of that book from bookshop.org, and I'm listening to both the record. I'm listening to the record and reading the book at the same time. There's just something about frontier stories, y'all. They're so romantic to a Florida boy, and there's so much of a mess there, but it just feels like a different country, right? Even though I've been out west plenty, and I've been lucky to spend a lot of time out west, but that wasn't my existence growing up. And of course, these stories are taking place like in the Wild West, so to speak. So I can't say enough about that. And finally, my vinyl copy. I say finally, no, that's not true. I have a couple more things. I'm kind of on a roll today with what I'm getting down on. My vinyl copy of Cooley, Hood, and Isbell live at the Shoals Theater came in about a week ago. If you're into vinyl, if you're like a collector or you like physical copies, this thing is so beautiful. Each disc is each vinyl is a different color, and then there's a gorgeous painting on the front, and it's just everything about the construction of it, if you're a vinyl head, is so beautiful. And then the record's crazy. I can't imagine being there that day and what that would have been like. I love it so much. I keep listening to it. Just three of the greatest songwriters of my generation, easily. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I think Mike Cooley would be considered one of the greatest country songwriters of all time if he was a country songwriter, so to speak. Like, his songs are really country songs, and he's in a rock band, but like, Jesus Christ, like, pound for pound, I'd put him up against just about anybody. What an amazing writer. The stories that he tells, the characters, and all three of those guys. I mean, I've been such a fan of the Truckers and all three of those guys' solo work and just everything that they do. As you know, right, I'm a pretty obsessive fan of all three. But y'all, listen to that. I'm sure you already are if you're listening to this show, but live at the Shoals Theater. If you're not, if you listen to the show because you know me or because you like the creative process part of it, but you don't listen to that Americana kind of music that I gravitate toward, check this out just from a pure brilliant standpoint. It's absolutely beautiful. I got one more for you. I'm a little late to the Amethyst Kia party. Better late than never. Just can't get enough of the two most recent singles, Hangover Blues and Wild Turkey, from the forthcoming record, Wary and Strange. That's all I got for you for right now. Oh, no, it's not true. One more. Fine, one more. The Ken Burns Hemingway documentary I finally finished last night. I'm pretty sure I mentioned it on the last episode. But this this documentary is so beautifully done, as Kim Burns typically does. And if you're a fan of writing or of pop culture or of just about anything that would potentially bring you to this show, you'll love that documentary. I happen to be a huge Hemingway fan, and it got me thinking a ton about the world we live in now and how I would have approached someone like Hemingway if they were, writing in a contemporary way right now. I was just thinking about like Ryan Adams, for example, whose art I love so much, but who I've tried not to I haven't spent any money on his work. In the last few years since the revelations about him came out. It just got me thinking about not necessarily separating art from artists, because we've spent a lot of time on that on the show, but thinking about like how we put into historical context people who weren't so good, and then also what weight we give to the fact that so many of those people, Hemingway included, behaved in the way they did in large part because of their upbringing and or some trauma. In his case, a lot of it was physical trauma, but there are so many other layers to who he was and how he ended up the way that he did and died the way that he did. And so like giving grace to people for going through trauma and dealing with that trauma and maybe being pretty shitty as a result, acting out in pretty shitty ways, while also recognizing that shitty behavior is shitty behavior, is a really hard thing. And it was amplified in my mind, in my consciousness, watching this particular film, because I love Hemingway's work so much, and I've spent so much time diving into the myth of Hemingway. Every trip to Key West, and in my 20s I was in Key West all the time. Every trip to Key West, just going on the Hemingway tour and thinking about, in Italy too, when I was able to spend a few weeks in Rome in law school. I used to call it getting my Hemingway on. I would like walk around drinking wine and writing. It sounds so stupid and pretentious, I guess, but it wasn't. It was fun. It was fun, and nothing good came out of it in terms of art, but it was part of my process and part of me becoming who I am now as a creative. And a lot of that, not only those experiences, but just reading his work, are due to Hemingway. So check that out if you're into Hemingway, for sure. But even if you're not, and you're just into the creative process or questions about just sort of how we reckon with the behavior of people who create great art and how much that does and should matter, check out Kim Burns' documentary. I love y'all so much. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, go out and create something. Cheers, y'all.